The streets of Rome never truly slept. Even at night, the air hummed with footsteps, the clatter of carts, and the murmur of voices in narrow alleys. But there was one sound that froze people in their tracks: the slow, hollow beat of a funeral drum. It was not just the call of death, it was a reminder of a world most Romans preferred not to see. A world of pale bodies burning incense, whispered curses, and those who made their living in the shadow of the grave. If you were a funeral worker in Rome, you were called a libitinarii. Your trade was death. Your tools were water, perfumes, masks, and coin. You saw faces twisted in grief, and others pretending for pay. You knew the weight of a body, the smell that no soap could erase, and the eyes of neighbors who crossed the street to avoid you. Why, you wouldn't last a day as a Roman funeral worker. Imagine waking up in a cramped, dim room that smells faintly of smoke and herbs. Your hands are rough from washing cold skin. On the wall hangs a simple wooden mask, its painted features frozen in a mournful frown, the face you wear when leading a procession. In Rome, death was not hidden away. Bodies were carried through the streets for all to see, but the work that made those displays possible happened behind closed doors. As a libitinarii, you were summoned as soon as someone died. You prepared the body, closing the eyes, washing the skin in warm water, rubbing scented oils into limbs already stiffening. You dressed the dead in fine robes, coins placed over their eyes or in their mouths for the journey to the underworld. Then came the mourners. Sometimes, families wept honestly. Other times, you hired women whose job was to cry as loudly as possible, tearing at their hair and clothing to make the grief seem grander. You arranged musicians, flute players, drummers whose notes would echo off Rome's stone walls as the procession moved toward the tomb. But your work was not just physical. Death carried spiritual dangers. Romans feared lemures, restless spirits of the unburied or improperly honored dead. If you made a mistake, if the rites were wrong, if the burial was delayed, it was not just the family's anger you risked, but the wrath of the dead themselves. And when the work was over, you were still marked. Romans considered contact with corpses unclean. People avoided shaking your hand, avoided eating with you. You earned a living, yes, but at the cost of being forever on the edge of society. The death of Germanicus, poison, paranoia, and public grief among the many deaths you might tend to. Few stirred the city like that of Germanicus. He was young, noble, and beloved, a general whose victories brought pride to the empire. His smile disarmed senators, and his presence lit up festivals. When news came that he had died far from Rome, whispers began immediately. The official word was illness. The streets told a different story. Poison, they said. Plots, perhaps even orders from the emperor himself, who feared Germanicus's popularity. As his body was brought home, the city transformed. People lined the roads, pressing forward to glimpse the bier draped in black. Women cried openly. Men stood silent, jaws tight with anger. You might have been among those preparing the funeral, arranging torches, guiding the slow march toward the heart of Rome. His funeral became more than a farewell. It was a performance of grief, a public storm of sorrow that veiled suspicion and political fury. The pyre rose high, wood stacked in careful tiers. When the flames took hold, they leaped into the night, carrying with them not only a man's body but the trust of a city. In those moments, the funeral was not just about death, it was about power. Who was honored, how, and before whom, told everyone where loyalty and danger lay. The underground tombs of the catacombs, early Christianity in the dark. Beneath the heavy stone foundations of Rome, past doorways that few dared to open, the earth gave way to a secret kingdom. To reach it, you had to leave behind the noise and brightness of the streets. You would step down narrow stairs carved directly into rock, your hands brushing against cold, damp walls. Each step took you deeper, the air growing cooler, stiller, and touched by the faint scent of oil smoke. The catacombs were not a single tunnel, but a labyrinth, miles of passageways running like veins beneath the city. The ceilings were low enough that a tall man had to bow his head. The walls were lined with niches, each just wide enough to hold a body wrapped in linen and sealed behind a slab of stone or clay. The light of a single torch would throw long, trembling shadows, making the carved walls seem to shift and breathe. Here, early Christians laid their dead to rest. The city above might be restless, loud, and filled with suspicion toward their gatherings. But down here, there was quiet, a sense of being outside the reach of power. The tombs were more than places of burial, they were sanctuaries, You might see a fish scratched into the plaster beside a name, or a shepherd painted with gentle strokes, carrying a lamb on his shoulders. These were messages for those who understood, symbols of hope and of life beyond death. Frescoes bloomed in small chambers, their colors faded but still warm. Feasts spread across tables, gardens full of flowers, rivers where no one grew thirsty. The work of a funeral laborer here was slow and deliberate. Every sound was amplified, the scrape of a chisel, the quiet thud of earth against stone, the whisper of cloth being unfolded. The stillness wrapped around you like a cloak, broken only by the distant flicker of another worker's torch turning a corner. Sometimes, the living came not to bury but to sit among the resting. Families would bring small oil lamps, their flames barely moving in the still air. They would kneel beside the sealed niche of a loved one and speak softly, their words meant for ears that could no longer hear, yet spoken as if the dead were just sleeping. The funeral workers kept their distance in these moments, letting the family's voices fill the darkness. When the day's work was finished and you climbed the long steps back toward the surface, the sunlight would feel strange, almost too sharp for your eyes. The smells of the marketplace, bread baking, meat roasting, wine pouring would seem louder than before. Yet, beneath it all, you carried the memory of the underground world, where time moved slowly, and the dead lay in perfect stillness. The emperor's funeral, burning thrones and living statues when an emperor died. The news spread through Rome like a ripple in a great still lake, first quietly, then all at once. Messengers whispered it in the markets, senators murmured it in the shadowed halls of the curia, and before the day was over, the entire city seemed to speak of nothing else. Preparations began immediately. This was no ordinary funeral. It was a state performance, a ritual binding the living and the dead, the people and the gods. Even before the body or the likeness was ready to be shown, the city itself began to change. The streets along the planned route were swept clean and sprinkled with water to keep the dust low. Tall poles were raised, draped with crimson banners that stirred in the summer breeze. Laurel wreaths hung above doorways, the green leaves a reminder of victory and eternal life. As a worker, you would see the heart of it. In a guarded courtyard, craftsmen worked by lamplight to prepare the imperial effigy. If the emperor's body had grown too frail in illness, the wax figure would serve in his place, a perfect image of youth and vigor. Dressed in robes of imperial purple and crowned with a golden laurel, jewels glimmered in the folds of fabric, catching the light each time the flame of a lamp trembled. The scent of warm beeswax filled the air, mingling with the sharper tang of freshly cut cedar used for the throne. The night before the funeral, Rome did not sleep. Torches burned in the streets, and the taverns along the route were full of low conversation. People spoke of the emperor's deeds, some with admiration, some with bitterness. But whatever their private feelings, none would miss the spectacle. At dawn, the first notes of the trumpets sounded long, mournful blasts that seemed to hang in the morning mist. The air was cool and damp, the stones underfoot still slick with dew. You would stand among your fellow workers, holding a torch or leading a mule carrying offerings. The priests appeared first, their linen robes white as morning clouds, each carrying a bronze censer. The smoke was sweet, heavy with myrrh and frankincense, curling upward like ghostly fingers. Behind them came the soldiers, lines of them, shields polished to a mirror shine, plumes swaying with each measured step. The clink of armor and the steady rhythm of marching feet were like the heartbeat of the procession. Then the emperor's likeness came into view. Set high upon a gilded platform, the effigy seemed to gaze over the crowd, its waxen features unchanging. Flowers cascaded around it, white lilies, deep red roses, and sprays of laurel. The perfume of the blooms was almost overwhelming, fighting for dominance against the thick incense smoke. The people surged forward for a better view, some reaching out as though to touch the air around him, as if the closeness itself would bless them. The route wound slowly through the city. Musicians played deep, drawn-out notes on curved trumpets and low horns, each sound resonating through the chests of the listeners. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, wide-eyed. Women tossed handfuls of petals into the air, and the streets became a patchwork of color under the sun. Finally, the procession reached the field of Mars, where the pyre waited. It was a towering structure, built in tiers like a wooden mountain. The lowest levels were draped in cloth gold, and above them, statues of gods and heroes stood in niches carved into the framework. Garlands of flowers and strings of small bronze bells hung from every edge, chiming softly in the breeze. At its summit, the emperor's effigy was seated upon a habacked throne, surrounded by treasures, shields polished bright as mirrors, carved ivory scepters, and bowls of rare spices. Each item was a symbol of power, meant to follow him into the next world. The crowd gathered in a great semicircle. The priests began their final prayers, voices rising and falling like waves on a shore. You could feel the warmth of so many bodies pressed together. Here the shifting of feet on gravel, the occasional cough swallowed quickly in the hush. When the first torches touched the base of the pyre, the wood caught with a crackle, then a roar. Flames licked upward, turning gold in the sunlight, then deep orange as they climbed higher. The heat rolled over the crowd in great waves, and the air shimmered between the watchers and the pyre. The perfume of the flowers turned bitter in the fire, mingling with the rich scent of burning cedar and the sharper tang of resin. The bells on the pyre sang as the flames reached them, and the crowd began a low chant, the words lost in the wind. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, the fire reflected in their eyes. The soldiers stood unmoving, their armor glinting as the smoke swirled around them. Then came the moment everyone had waited for, the release of the eagle. Hidden until now, the great bird burst into the air, wings beating powerfully, its cry sharp and high above the crackle of the flames. The crowd erupted in a single voice, cheering and calling blessings as they watched it rise into the sky. To them, the eagle was no mere creature. It was the emperor's soul, carried upward to the realm of the gods, joining the company of Jupiter himself. Long after the eagle vanished into the distance, the pyre burned on. The crowd thinned as the day wore on, but you remained, tending the fire, making sure nothing was left undone. The heat was relentless, your skin dry and tight from the hours spent near the flames. The once gilded throne was nothing more than a blackened skeleton of wood. When at last the fire died down, the ash was gathered with care. Some would be placed in a golden urn and carried to the imperial mausoleum. The rest would scatter in the wind, carried into the city, into the fields, into the Tiber, just as the memory of the emperor would scatter among the people. And for you, the funeral worker, there was no rest yet. Tomorrow, there would be another procession, another body to wash, another tomb to prepare. The grandeur of an imperial farewell faded quickly, but the work of death was endless. Conclusion. In the Roman world, death was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because it touched every family, every street, every season. Extraordinary, because each passing weather of a farmer, a soldier, or an emperor was shaped by ritual, belief, and the hands of those who worked in its shadow. The libitinarii walked a narrow path between reverence and revulsion. Honored for their service, yet shunned for their touch. They saw grief in its rawest form, and joy hidden in mourning's mask. They moved between torchlight and daylight, between silence and the thunder of drums. To live as a funeral worker in Rome was to stand at the threshold, neither fully among the living nor the dead. And in that space, you learned that every life, no matter how grand or humble, was bound by the same final journey. If you enjoyed wandering through the streets, tombs, and pyres of ancient Rome with me, I'd love for you to stay for more. This channel is where unusual and often forgotten corners of ancient history come alive. So, if you want to hear more stories like this of strange customs, hidden worlds, and lives lived long ago, make sure to subscribe, and join me next time.